beginning by thanking, of course, the participants to be here and the listeners. This is one of the, I guess, more than 100 panels on the democratization of work that has been organized, and this one I have organized on a topic that I consider quite insufficiently discussed among scholars who take seriously the idea that work is not sufficiently organized, which is the topic of how our own work is democratized, whether it is democratized or not. That is to say, whether in the university we experiment a higher or a lower level of democracy. And for this reason, I've set up this panel where we have representatives from 3 different universities: Leiden in the Netherlands, Paris Créteil from France, and the University of Bologna from Italy. And the two questions we would like to ask and discuss in this panel is, on the one hand, I said, to what extent or at which level or how universities appear to be sufficiently or highly democratized workplaces, and what can be done to improve the democratic quality of our own work environment. And the other one is, which is another blind spot in my sense of us academics, is when we talk about democratizing the university, which means taking seriously the idea that employees are the citizens of the enterprise. What do we mean by citizens? Who are the citizens of the enterprise? I guess we academics tend very often, or maybe too often, to assume that we academics are the citizens of the enterprise, but in this way we forget that in a standard modern university there is at least one staff for each academic and maybe 20 to 30 students for each academic, and therefore the community, the academic community, is much broader than that of academics. And this is another question we will discuss today, particularly with the contribution of our colleagues from Bologna, which precisely comes from the non-academic permanent staff. So we begin with a presentation from Alvin and Stéphanie Mignot, which are both associate professors in management at the University of Paris Créteil. And the title of their communication is Legal and Other Forms of Democracy in French Universities from 1968 to Nowadays. Then the second communication will be from Vicky Kosta, who is Assistant Professor of European Law at Leiden University. And the presentation is titled Dutch Universities at the Crossroad. And then the last one from Marco Degli Esposti, who is Director General at the University of Bologna, and Verdiana Bandini, who is Director of Research Services Division at the same university. The participation of administrative and technical staff to the election of the Rector, a story from Bologna. These are the 3 communications, and now I leave the floor to Alvin and Stéphanie. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, Roberto, thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you very much for inviting us to participate to this forum. I'm very glad to do this with Alvin, who invited me. So thank you, Alvin, to make me participate to this discussion. Can you hear me well? Because yes. I don't see you, so I cannot see whether you see me or not.
We are there and we hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So I will start the presentation, and then Alvin will take the follow-up and close it. So first of all, I thought maybe it was useful for the audience to understand better the brief history, actually, of the way decision-making bodies and deliberative bodies work in French universities. First, I have to say that these bodies, collective bodies, are pretty new in France, because before 1968, actually only full professors allowed to have a seat in the university council. But then everything changed in 1968, because after the huge social events that took place in France at that time, where the society at large was expecting some more participation, more democracy, a new law was put on the agenda. It was called the Loi Fort, and its objective was really to strengthen the democratic settings in the university's governance. So for doing this, the Loi Fort created new university decision-making bodies, new councils, in which not only full professors were elected, but also professors from lower ranks, but also staff and students representatives and external personalities. So this is actually the first really strong attempt to open up decision-making at the university level to a lot of constituencies, internal and external. After this date, actually, we can divide the time in two different periods. And I ground my discussion here on many empirical studies that have been done on university governance in France. But until the mid-80s, we find that university councils were weak in the sense that they would not make really decisions. At that moment, they were merely, first of all, they lacked from a strong recognition. Internally, in universities at that time, university professors, academic members thought that those councils were not really important and they were time-consuming, and it was not worth spending some energy in being elected in those councils. And in terms of decisions, those councils would merely either reproduce the decisions made at the ministry level and just endorse that decision downwards, and otherwise they would endorse the decisions made at the faculties level and not arbitrate anything. By the end of the 80s, the landscape changed a little bit, because at that time there were reforms put in place in France which tried to strengthen the university autonomy. And so at that time, the council regained a little bit of recognition within the institution, but at the same time, there was a simultaneous rise of university presidents whose power was strengthened as well, and usually who prepared very much the decisions made by the councils, the latter having the impression, broad impression, that they were merely rubber stamps bodies. So the question, so now if we look at the situation, the more contemporary situation since, let's say, the end of the 90s to nowadays, the major question we ask, we want to focus on today is whether the trend is to erode the democracy in French universities. So we decided to confront some empirical studies in the light of Roberto's definition of democracy in your book of 2019, if I'm right. And so, Roberto, you define three criteria of democracy: inclusive authority, social involvement, relational parity. So for inclusive authority, I would say that as far as French universities are concerned, it's very important to see that when executive teams, so presidential teams, come with prepared decisions to the general assemblies of the councils, usually, most of the times, these decisions are very much prepared. They entail a lot of negotiations with different constituencies within the university, so that when the decision has to be voted, it can give the impression to the elected member that it's like it's done. They don't have to. They cannot, have any impact on this decision. But actually, the decision is already quite mature. So it receives, in a way, a large consent within the institution. Okay, that's one point. The other point is that, and it's related to the first, of course, is that usually decisions in French universities are very rarely made by top-down command. They most of the time, especially when they regard academic matters, teaching or research activities, most of the time these decisions are made by self-censor or peer control rather than managerial decisions. So I would say the criteria of inclusive authority is more or less respected in that respect. What about social involvement? Here, I just wanted to show you 3 numbers that are correspond to responses we received from a large survey we led on the 80 public universities and across. I think we received like 1,600 responses, and you can see on these numbers how much the collective involvement of our respondents is important. There is a great sense of organizational citizenship, of participating in collective tasks in universities in France, and actually a quite high sense of like public service. So again, I would say that the social involvement is quite high in our public institutions. On the last criteria defined by Roberto, I would say my feelings are more mixed. On one hand, if you look at some councils in French universities where the elected members, even if they don't participate in the preparation of decisions, say that they feel they had an impact on decisions, it's councils where deliberation can last hours and hours. And for me, the time which is taken by executive teams to prepare their decisions, to argue, to make strong argumentations about their decision, and to let the people within the councils deliberate, works as a status allocation. So I am deliberating with you, I let you discuss my proposal. So it's a way to allocate you the status of someone who deserves to be convinced. And so in that sense, internally, deliberation serves really as an integration of the decision, feeling involved, and of course legitimates also the decisions made by the executive team. On the other hand, and that's why my feelings are more mixed on this issue, what we also observe, it's quite interesting, is that more and more executive teams prepare their decisions not with elected members, either elected academic leaders like deans or department chairs or elected members of the councils, but they prepare more and more their decisions with small groups, which are ad hoc groups and composed most of the time of like people from people who have a strong scientific reputation, for instance. And so they make up the decisions with this sort of elite rather than the elected members of the university. So in that sense, elected members of the universities are maybe more and more excluded from the making up of the decision, if you want so. So before letting Alvin make his point about university mergers, I would just say that I think it's to understand democracy in universities, you have to look at the same time at what's going on inside the deliberative bodies, but also outside. You have to look at the process, the entire process of decision making. I think deciding at that point whether how a democracy, what is the level of democracy in French universities, it's difficult to have a definite conclusion on that, because of course it depends on the weight you give to the 3 criteria developed by Roberto. And finally, and this is very, very important, each institution across the French landscape has a very, very peculiar practice of democracy, from very, very centralized like governance system to very democratic ones. So it really depends on the history of the institution and of course of its status. And now Alvin will make the point with a case of a recent university which has been merged recently, and will describe this peculiarity. Thank you for listening, and I let you, Alvin,
Okay, thank you, Stéphanie. So actually, my point will be about nowadays French universities, and particularly the mergers that have been taking place like since a couple of years now. And I will try to question these mergers as they obviously transform democracy. And these are really more like questions for us to discuss than really answers or anything of that sort. To start with, I'll say a word on this quite recent tendency of the French universities to merge. Of course, the idea is for them to become bigger and hopefully greater entities and more suited for international standards and, of course, rankings. So for time purposes, but maybe we can get back to this later, I will not comment on the political and financial aspects of this typically new public management inspired movement. And I will focus on how these mergers impact democratic features within the French universities. So I'll give you an example to start with, and then we'll go into some more theoretical aspects. Actually, I get back to Roberto's ideas about democracy, and we'll try to draw some ideas that are really, again, more questions. Yeah. So let's take this example of a recent merger leading to the creation of the University of Paris. And let's have a look at some aspects of this merger. And particularly, I'll try to compare the situation in terms of governing bodies of one of the merging university before, of course, the merger, and then of the situation of the University of Paris in terms of these elected bodies or non-elected bodies. We'll see the difference. So if we look at the governing bodies of one of the universities before the merging process, we have a number of boards and assemblies that all belong to what I would call the legal democracy, because these boards and assemblies are mandatory for a university to work as such. So, for example, before the merger, we had an executive board made up of 36 members. So, for example, 16 academics, 6 members of the administrative staff, 4 members from other public institutions, and again. Then we had 2 other very important, so to say, specialized assemblies, one in charge of the research strategy with 36 members, and the other one dealing with teaching and student life with 36 members as well. Then we have a managing board, which gathers a smaller group of leaders, namely the president and the vice presidents, the chief executive as well, to cite a few. And this board is a non-elected body and supposed to give advice to the elected ones. So the 3 previously cited. And finally, we have the faculty's deans that are also part of another assembly, which is supposed to help the elected governing bodies to take their decisions. So now if we look at the merged university on the right side of your screen, and this merged university that is actually claiming a democratic governance in its own statutes that I went through recently. So one significant change is that the executive board of the merged university is now made up of only 28 people. So 10 academics, 3 members of the administrative staff, and so on. Whereas the number of students and academic and administrative staff more than doubled in the merging process. So we would have expected this executive board to be closer to 70 people and not 28. The same could be said about the specialized assemblies that we had previously and that still remain. They're also smaller because each of them has only 30 members. So basically we have less people in those assemblies, the main ones, whereas the merged university is of course much bigger. So my questions would then be, is this merger presenting something less democratic, or have we lost some democratic features in the merging process? And these are of course open questions for us to discuss. At least what we can say is that we have a sort of a restriction on what I would term the decision democracy, meaning the bodies, governing bodies that take decisions, as the executive board, for example, which has really decreased in size. But the answer is not so obvious, as at the same time we have a new assembly actually created within the merging process. and belonging to what we could term the debating democracy, because this new assembly doesn't have the power to decide. And this assembly is called the Senate and is made up of 46 members. And this assembly is actually an intermediary body between the executive board and the faculties. So we have a new assembly here. Another new assembly is also created during the merging process, named the Strategic Orientation Board, which kind of resembles the former managing board, but this one is made up of 15 academics that are not working at the University of Paris. So this is a big difference with the managing board we had previously. So maybe we have less democracy, but we might also face a different democratic distribution of power with a restricted decision democracy, but a larger debating democracy with new assemblies being created. And in addition, if we enlarge our scope and pay attention to other forms of democracy, I mean, not only the legal ones, those assemblies that I've talked about, we also see that the merger was the opportunity for new, for example, student associations to step onto the stage, because students from different universities needed to know each other. And those associations reinforce the student democracy, which is another aspect of the democratic life within universities. So this merger has obviously led to recomposition of the legal democracy and to a new balance with other forms of democratic life, such as student associations that actually blossomed during the merger. So can you just move to the last slide, please? Oh, great, thank you. So my general impression is also that it's quite difficult to measure democracy within academic settings, and this kind of compositional approach that you can see here seems to me somehow helpful in understanding how democracy evolves, changes on a continuous recomposition of its components. And this is where I get back to Roberto's 3 core democratic principles to help us understand this recompositional process. So we could have academic systems where what Roberto terms relational parity would be dominant, something that we cannot really see if we only have a legal approach, and this requires some more qualitative research in order to understand the precise social relations within academic settings. But we could also have places where inclusive authority happens to be the main democratic feature, and this principle is quite consistent with the legal democratic features that Stéphanie and I talked about. And finally, the social involvement might be striking in some universities with, for instance, very rich student associations life, if I get back to that example. Just a few words to finish with. If we obviously need these 3 principles to coexist for a real democratic system to be considered as such. And the question then could be, what are the conditions for the 3 principles to exist in a kind of balanced way? And I think that an international comparative perspective could here be interesting, so as to see if the different national academic systems give a preference to one or another of the principles. So I think our time is over. Thank you for listening, and we'd be glad to discuss all this with you at the end. Thank you.
Not hearing me. I was saying that before giving the floor to Vicky, I just wanted to say to everybody that if you can already begin writing your questions into the Q&A chat on the right, and if someone who is attending but who is not on the screen would like to be on it, also for directly asking your question, you simply have to ask to be on the screen, and I will allow you to be there. And also I wanted to ask to Verdiana and to check whether your micro is working now, but you are still muted. Sorry for this technical interruption, but
normally it should work now because Verdiana did the tests.
you can try maybe with another computer while we...
And we will...
And yeah. Yeah, and we move to the second presentation from Vicky Kosta about the Netherlandish.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
system.
inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in this panel with all these colleagues from different disciplines. It doesn't happen so often in my line of work, so I'm very happy to be here. I will quickly present the evolution of the Dutch governance system, if only to show that whatever model we may have at the time is not cast in stone, and to whatever we have can be changed. And there we might see some similarities to the French system, at least in when we talk about the 68 movement. I'll do that very briefly before I explain the current Dutch governance model, and then I'll try to highlight some challenges which have to do with internal democracy or the deficit thereof, but also beyond. So there is this idea of new public management having entered more visibly the Dutch system. I think I get a sense than the French system. So I want to talk about that because I think these issues are connected. The kind of ethos and ideology that runs the internal system is influenced by the external system. So starting with the evolution, so in the Netherlands, we have 4 basic models, one could say, and this is not research that I have done, but a colleague, Joris Groen, he has written a book on academic freedom in the Netherlands, and he identifies these 4 stages, the models. So he says from about 1850 to 1960, we have the classical university, which is marked by a dual governance structure. So on the one hand, we have the management of financial administrative matters, so management affairs in the hands of the Crown and a board of trustees with important powers, important financial powers, and even powers of appointment of professors. And then on the other hand, we have the academic senate, which is composed of full professors, and the faculties, them being responsible of educational and research governance. And between the Crown and the academic senate, you have this buffer, this board of trustees, that perhaps formally both the Crown and this board of trustees might seem to be very, very powerful, but in practice, he says it's been a bit more balanced. And if you look at the way this board was meeting, it was more of a supervisory board, and the Crown was more distant than one might think. So then he says the second model is from 1960 to 1970. It's the professors' universities, he says. And it's marked by the same dual structure of separation between management, financial, admin matters, and then governance of education and research. But professors get formally and more visibly a very important role, a sort of consolidation of their power, because they're explicitly positioned as the supervisors of other academic staff. And so at that stage, both the classical university and the professors' university, they have 2 problems. He identifies one problem is the absence of a strong executive board that can meet the challenges of governing a university that's been increasing and needs more answering to daily management tasks. And the other problem is, of course, representation. And here we are on our topic of democracy. So the voice of an important part of academic staff that was playing a crucial role at the university was not represented. And that was then changed with the democratic university from 1970 to 1997. And no doubt this must have been very much influenced by the French movements and probably copied to a certain extent that model. And so at that stage, we have the introduction of a new dual structure. So on the one hand, it is then the University Council that Stéphanie was talking about, with representation of academic staff from all ranks, non-academic staff, students, and also other members of society. So I think that's very much inspired by the French model. And then we have also the introduction of a university board for the sort of more daily management. And so he says this model solved problems of representation. Well, solved, well, probably not if I also look at the French story. I mean, probably there were problems also with that, but certainly formally remedying an important shortcoming of a democratic deficit. But he says it created other problems, and those were problems of governance, because the idea was decentralization, co-management, and it was not very clear how the different layers of governance were relating to each other. So on a daily basis, if you need consents for almost all decisions, that leads to problems, stagnation. So he says that led to that kind of problem. I'm not sure how drastic that problem is in hindsight, but so he says this is one thing that was pointed out in the literature. Now, after that, and this is where we're coming to today's model, from 1997 to today, we have what he calls the management university. And that comes hand in hand with this new philosophy of new public management, how we should govern public institutions, this idea of having them efficient and functioning and organized based on corporate market models, right? And that's what we have today, that model. And I will now explain a bit more the formal framework of internal governance and how it relates to external governance. So formally, what we have now is a top-down, hierarchical, centralized approach with the unity of management of administrative, financial affairs and education and research governance in one body at the top of the university. Now, in preparation for this talk, I talked to our former dean at the Leiden Law Faculty, because I was trying to understand what does that mean in practice. So this top-down approach. And so he said there's one thing that one should definitely bear in mind, that in practice there has been and there is a lot of variety across universities in the Netherlands based on institutional culture. So, and that's something that a formal chart will not capture, most probably. So you have a university where professors, individual professors that rank lower in the hierarchy, might be much more powerful than one might think if we look at this scheme. And that's based on the individual culture that you have at a place. And you can see that by certain decisions being taken by consensus with the lower rank, even though that does not necessarily have to be the case based on the formal structure. But of course, the fact that we have that formal structure means it gives room also for a really top-down, hierarchical, centralized approach, and certain universities really function like that. So at the university level, we have this executive board that takes a central position. It's composed by a chair, a vice chair, and a rector magnificus. The rector magnificus is typically an academic, and typically one of the three people will be a financial professional manager, right? Coming from the finance work to run these big budgets. And so that central executive board is appointed by members of an external supervisory board that's been created to be a buffer between the ministry and the university level. And so if you read the law and the charts, you read all kinds of management duties that this board has. But I've been told in practice, one of its most important tasks is how money is internally divided among faculties, and based on what criteria. And that is, of course, a very powerful tool to have. You can steer so much by using this tool if you want to. So as an example, think of an executive board that gives premiums to faculties that get big external research funds in, right? So that will change the daily culture and functioning and work allocation in the faculties. And that there is room for that for the executive board to do, and that will depend on what the executive board wants to do. And so at faculty level, you have the same hierarchy formally represented with the deans being at the top level. They are not elected, they're designated volunteers. They are appointed by the executive board. And they are, again, they have this unity of financial, administrative, education, research matters, management in that. And tasks are then also further executed by the education board and the examination board. So in terms of the question of democracy, what is important to highlight is that at both levels, the university level and the faculty level, you have representative advisory bodies that are elected. So there is this element of election and representation, but of course their powers are not the ones they used to have with the kind of French-inspired university council model. So what do they do? The exam and education regulations are put in for approval in front of them. They have the formal right to consent to the budget, but they don't have a formal budget supervisory authority power. And so again, where there is money, there is power. And if you can't have a real say on this, then you lose power. So in practice, on my asking, I've been told they can tweak the budget a little bit, but there's certain things in the budget that are really set, and I assume the chunk of it. And so that power is not there. In terms of external governance, then, I talked about the supervisory board, that is the buffer between the ministry and the university. So the minister appoints this supervisory board, which oversees the executive board's functioning. So it's there to give advice, to ask critical questions, more of a supervisory function. But I think what is important to highlight in the Dutch system in terms of external governance is an increase move towards external accountability. And that takes the forms of quality assurance in education and research being checked externally. So since 1985, the educational programs have been accredited by an external panel. And this system got further professionalized over the years. In 2003, we had the setting up of an independent accreditation organization. And in 2011, we had even more sophisticated launch of a new accreditation system in which both program accreditation and institutional accreditation occurs. So we have periodical external evaluations of both teaching and research programs, and that impacts internal workflows. And what it de facto means is an increase in bureaucracy and administrative work from the university level in order to respond to these external accreditation bodies. So you need to keep a paper flow of everything you do in a very kind of bureaucratic way. So then, in conclusion, the picture looks like this. Internally, formally at least, more centralized hierarchical management, although with wide variations based on institutional culture. Externally, this increased demand of accountability, which creates bureaucratization internally. And on all of this is operating, and that is very important to understand how the Dutch universities are functioning today. All of this is operating against the context of diminished public spending for higher education systems. So spending has stagnated or even decreased a bit, but student numbers have skyrocketed over time. And so that means that you have to do with a bit of less money, much more work on top of your increased bureaucratical work. And so what is the consequence of that? Increased workloads, increased performance pressure, and that's part of this new public management idea, because also the way staff gets evaluated internally, it's based on yearly performance agreements, targets that have to be met. Performance pressure for researchers also because they have to compete for external funding. So the bulk of the research money was taken out of the universities and put into competitive research grant authorities. So that means that you as a researcher, if you want to have real research time, you need to buy yourself that time. So the philosophy is one of competition between universities and faculties, because you need students. As part of the budget is performance-based, how many students graduate, how many PhDs you have. You have competition among researchers for the research funds. And that, with increased workload, means or begs the question, do these people then have time to govern their own affairs democratically and think about how to govern their own affairs democratically in a university? If you're put in that context, how much time is there for reflection and meaningful participation? So I've been told that in these weekend bodies that are actually elected, it's usually junior people that participate, but not so many are interested, and people are also not participating so much in the elections because everybody's striving to survive with their workload and to compete in this system. So it's this efficiency, accountability, competition, that ethos that runs here. And so what are the remedies, and how can we think of meeting the challenges that the system is facing today? Well, I would say reflect on the nature and purpose of the university, and researchers in higher education studies have thought about that. What is the reason why we have universities? To educate a highly skilled workforce for the markets, or critically informed and engaged citizens? If we do both, how do we do both? Can we do both? Where is the emphasis? Do we generate knowledge based on scientific standards for the sake of it? Or do we think of knowledge generation in terms of increasing economic value? Contribution to society, if so, in what form? It's different to talk about universities increasing the GDP as opposed to, leading to social cohesion. And typically you will see all of these buzzwords in policy documents, but the question is, where is the emphasis here? That will definitely have an impact on how we think of internal governance structure. Think of the nature of the activities of academics. I think that's something to reflect on. A purposeful creative activity that requires intrinsic motivation is different from an activity which you will perform when there is a carrot and a stick, because actually you don't enjoy doing so much. In any event, I would think, and this is my legal eye on this topic, whatever you do when you organize the universities, when you think of a governance structure, you have to be in line with international, national, regional human rights or fundamental rights guarantees, and that would be academic freedom here. And academic freedom is, of course, a concept that varies in the way it's understood across jurisdictions. At the international level, it's not very clearly defined. In the Dutch constitution, it's not expressly set out, but other systems have a very strong protection of it. I'm thinking of the German system, and I'm sure Wissenschaftsfreiheit in Germany is very much going to impact the way in which governance is going to take shape. And if you think of academic freedom, I'm not just thinking of the idea of freedom to research and teach, but also autonomy and self-governance. If you look at the international documents, also soft law documents, you'll see that self-governance, collegiality are concepts that are included there and understood as part of academic freedom. Part of realizing academic freedom means also to give sufficient funding to universities. And there, I think, in the Netherlands, we have a big room for improvement from the way it looks now. And finally, if you think of collegiality, self-governance, and autonomy, I'm coming full circle back to this idea of democratic governance. Should we consider moving back to the old democratic model of universities in the Netherlands? The system could be changed by changing the legal framework. I think there the question is, how can sort of old criticisms of that system not functioning very well and being effective in terms of governing, how could these be remedied? I think that's something to reflect on, and I will finish my presentation with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I'm giving the floor now to the Bologna team. Let's hope the technical problem is solved.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I have two devices now. I'm working with the PC, so I will share my screen, but also with the mobile phone for the microphone. So I hope it works.
We can hear you perfectly.
That's very, very good news. Let me know if you can see the screen. Just a second, I need to open up the presentation again. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
All right. So first of all, thank you very, very much for this invitation. I'm here with the Director General, Marco Degli Esposti, and Verdiana Bandini. Thank you very much for inviting us. So I will start the presentation and leave the conclusions, let's say, to my director. We change a little bit the focus of the discussion, talking about the let's say the participation of the administrative and technical staff, and taking the example of the election of the rector, that in Italy and in Bologna particularly is quite recent. I will go quite quickly on the context, so a little bit about the University of Bologna, the governance of Italian university, because we thought that maybe not all of the people attending the event know this system, and then the role of the rector and what our experience was with 2 election rounds that we had in 2015 and 2021. And then some reflections on how the technical and administrative staff contribution is changing. We call it PTA, Personale Tecnico Amministrativo in Italian, and let's say some concerns about the representation, the democratic representation currently being applied in Italy in our university. Just a few words to say that the University of Bologna is considered to be the most ancient university in Europe. It is a very large university, comprehensive, so including all different disciplines, and with 5 campuses. As you can see, we put here some data just to give you an example of the size of the university. We have 87,000 students, 32 departments, nearly 3,000 faculty and staff, a lot of different components, museum, libraries, hospitals, and so on. At the universities, the 3 main components of the university community is composed are, let's say, the professors and researchers, the teaching staff, the technical administrative staff, and students. So in what was, let's say, a traditional way of thinking of this personnel, we basically see the researchers and professors as the production, let's say, component of the university, and the technical administrative staff as the support staff, which is correct on one side. But in the last decades, let's say, we have seen an increasing professional profile that is emerging in technical administrative staff, which is a little bit changing the old paradigm. So how is the governance of Italian universities working? So we have a big reform in 2010 that basically stipulated the existence of a certain number of governing bodies, which are the rector, first of all, the academic senate, which is elected, and basically it's representing the whole university community, and the different scientific areas of the universities, with a small representation of students and technical administrative staff. Then we have the board of directors or board of governors, which is a very a smaller body, with duties mainly, or basically also on financing, on financials within the university. We have a board of auditors, a university assessment unit, and the director general. Students normally are represented at least as 15% in all collegial governing bodies, except for the Board of Auditors, which is mainly composed of external professional people. So what is the role of the rector? The rector in Italian universities is the legal representative. It is finally the one giving the strategic direction to the university. It has a power called of initiative and the coordination of scientific and education activities. It is responsible for pursuing the goals of the universities. It is the one proposing a 3-year programming document, is the one proposing the 3-year and yearly budget and final account, is the one choosing, let's say, proposing the Director General, and also she is responsible for disciplinary proceedings. So, according to the law, to the reform law, the rector is elected among the full professors. It is elected for a single mandate of 6 years, which are non-renewable, and then finally is nominated with decree of the Minister for Research and University, which is basically a ratification of the election results. In the past, in the medieval time, the rector was elected by students, and then it was basically in all the subsequent times elected by the academic component of the university, so professors and researchers, apart from a small parenthesis in the 30s and 40s when it was nominated by the king. Since 1989, we also see the law that stipulates, expresses the autonomy of the university and the self-government principle that was mentioned also in one of the previous presentations, which is, however, an imperfect self-governance principle at the moment. Still, the university are subject to a number of laws which are very similar to the one for the other public bodies. And as far as the technical and administrative staff is concerned, originally the PTA could not participate to the election. Since 1989, all universities could decide whether to foresee or not a role for PTA in their statutes, and not all of them did, at least in Italy. Bologna did not. And then since law in 2010, so the law of reform, all universities were basically obliged to rewrite their statutes, and all universities in Italy decided to include PTA in the elector base. So all permanent PTA staff at the moment votes for the rector, although the voting is weighted. So one vote does not count one, as for the professors and researchers. It counts 15% of one. We had 2 election rounds, one in 2015 and one in 2021. And these elections were a very interesting occasion to see a sort of mobilization of the technical and administrative personnel. We had a number of institutional meetings that were organized at the university between candidates and the whole community. But we had also meetings reserved for PTA, where candidates could discuss about issues that were of interest specifically for PTA. We also had several meetings with individual departments, centers, or groups, or interest groups, to discuss specific issues. The participation of the PTA staff to the election was very high. You can see here some data. It was increasing from 2015 to 2021. And basically, it covered about the 70% of all those entitled to vote. What I would like to tell you, let's say, as an example of the discussion that took place for the election of the rector, is the case of the division I am responsible for, which is the Research Services Division, which is a division basically working with competitive funding, especially European competitive funding, and probably with a lot of people who are characterized by a certain professional maturity and probably quite a habit of working very closely together with professors and researchers in a partnering way. So in working together like a team towards the goals of reaching, developing projects and getting funding for these projects. So in both the elections, what we did was to organize a meeting with each candidate director, and we did so in a way that it was as transparent and equal as possible, with a fixed timing, but also with a discussion that took place before the starting of these meetings, to elaborate a list of questions to pose to all rectors, all the same, to each of them, where we tried to elicit the position of the candidates with regard to what I call the hot issues for research and for research in our university, so also for the organization of research. What was this about? We got a very interesting response also from the candidates, since they acknowledged that the discussion we had was not only aimed at understanding the position on let's say personal issues, but also to give them a focus on specific topics that needed to be considered within the university. So basically, they acknowledged that we helped through these questions to build their program, to build their awareness on where the universities could go in the future, so the direction of the university. So this, let's say, is a case, it's not the only one in the university, where a different role for PTA is emerging. So I pass the floor to my director.
Okay. Thank you, Verdiana. Good afternoon at all. I am Marco Degli Esposti, Managing Director of Bologna University, and I'm very glad to be here and share with you our experience. And let's get started. Some thoughts about the experience. A new paradigm for PTA contribution. I'm now going to list the positive aspects that emerged in the recent participation of PTA staff in the election of the rector. Starting point in the wide PTA participation. That means, in our opinions, unanimous consideration of the rector as an expression of the whole university community, a strong sense of belonging and affiliation to the institution, and an increase in the desire for the PTA staff to participate in each step in the election process, despite the difficulties difficulties involved in conducting the larger part of the process online due to the pandemic. And a new approach of candidates toward PTA availability for dialogue and discussion as for academic staff. Candidates was obliged to take responsibility for problems, issues of interest for PTA. And we saw also a new approach of part of the PTA with regard to the governance, interest and debate, not only for what concern those typical topics and issues which are directly affecting PTA, for instance, salary, careers, working condition, etc., but also focus on the strategic agenda in the development perspectives, in the choices that will affect the university on the future. And in other words, the recent election of the rector have brought out even more that PTA is not only support staff anymore, but a partner for the development of the university, bringing professional content that complements the competencies of academic personnel and willing to contribute and share responsibility towards settled goals and objectives. Now I will focus on the problematic aspect related to the participation of PTA staff at the election rectors, related or more precisely on open question on it. The participation of the election of the rector shows the great potential of new paradigm of PTA contribution and in unlocking a new and more constructive way of collaborating between PTA and academic personnel, but also show a crisis of traditional PTA representatives, especially unions, in grasping this change and embracing a new role of PTA. PTA representatives are those who have institutional access to dialogue with the university governance by the Italian law. They are increasingly failing in reflecting real PTA expectation and priorities. And the crisis of PTA representation can be seen through the participation to the different elections where they are involved. For example, last rector election, 73% for rollout. Election PTA representative in the academic senate, 60%. Election of junior representatives, 50%, and technical election in technical and administrative staff council, only 23%. But also the new data, the data that show the crisis is this: trade unions membership is steadily decreasing in the last years at the University of Bologna. The graph compares the incidence of the number of trade unions members on total employment and the relative percentage trend. While the number of employed remain almost stable, the number of trade unions members has decreased by 11% in 5 years. The percentage of trade union members in total employment rose from 22.5% to 19.27%. Final consideration, trade unions appear to be no longer able to provide a vision and give voice to emerging PTA professional skills and roles, and still unions have important prerogatives in the decision that concern PTA in the university, but also in all the public sector in Italy. But the debate risks to be monopolized by an increasingly self-referential and sometimes populist trade union component. Okay, but the main question, in my opinion, is with the crisis of traditional representation model for PTA, who collects and make visible the voice of PTA, who provide guidance to PTA electors. We can expect new form of representation of the PTA, at least with regard to the enhancement of professionalism, or trade union will be able to evolve, or will a new representation model be thought of it? I think that the valorization of PTA professionalism is my responsibility as managing director, but also is a responsibility of the university managers of the division. But at the same time, I understood that this instance needs a political representation that until now there has not been. So, thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verdiana and Marco. Before giving the floor to the question, I wanted to make a quick comment. I was considering in listening to this last presentation, but having in mind what Alvin said in his own about having to be careful between the formal structures of the legal structure of representation and what happens in reality, because what we heard from Bologna, and the same things could be said, for example, for what happens in France and called the études anciennes sociales, where basically the rector or the president is of course elected, but there is also an interesting process in which you have really a political campaign in which candidates compete for votes, and therefore they really engage potential voters, and as I mean, in the case of Bologna, potential voters are PTA or academics, doesn't matter, so they go to look for votes in both contexts. And I was thinking while listening to you to what happens in my institution, the National Research Center, where, for example, we are right now voting for the super advisory board. And I simply receive an email with a list of names, and I can vote. That's it. Nobody addressed me with a program. Nobody tried to convince me to vote for them. And perhaps, I guess, if I understand what Alvin told me during a conversation, he was surprised that in Bologna the rate of participation is so huge. 74% for the PTA, 90% for the academic, which means that, I mean, we had a political election in Italy for municipalities now, it was around 50%. So the same people, they don't go to vote for their major, but they vote for their rector. And in a sense, that means that the quality and the nature and the process through which democracy is implemented is sometimes more important than the forms. And then I don't know whether it could be an interesting hint for Vicky, who takes a legal perspective on this. And then the question could be also to what extent, how legal forms can be more than empty structures and promote real processes through which some kind of deliberation, participation, and discussion takes place, and people feel really involved into a political process in which they feel their opinion matter, and also there is a feedback, as also Verdiana and Marco was saying, in which to this discussion the political program of candidates really changes. So I guess it's interesting to see how the three countries, to some extent, the general form seems to be more or less not that different, but then the way things are done makes lots of difference. So I don't know if you want to react before I read you some questions.
Yeah, good point, Roberto. I think you're entirely right. The process is as much important as the result, and so the comparison here is very insightful. So that would be interesting to go further and to try to kind of compare in more details the way different processes work in different countries, and obviously what we have with the official and legal governing bodies is just one aspect of it all. And so it's really, it would be interesting to get deeper into some kind of social inquiries into how it works and what sorts of different things emerge during these processes. That would be something I think really interesting to look for. Yeah,
I think what is key here is to, if we have to go under the skin, under the formal structures, you really have to see in a very empirical ways to figure out who is preparing the decisions really. Because even within the same country like France, across the same universities with the same structures, public universities, the same councils, the governance styles are so different from one institution to another. I've just finished a very huge study about how 4 institutions have handled the COVID crisis. And you can clearly see that some of the institutions dealt with it very centrally, while others totally relied on their democratic councils. So it really depends on the past history, the influence of the unions within the institution, etc., etc. So this diversity is very, very important, I think.
Maybe a question to Stéphanie. Do you think then that also the people who happen to be at a certain time in a certain place, now despite the institutional culture, may have a big impact? Or would you say that the history of a university, let's say if one is typically very democratic or another one is typically very hierarchical, will be a more important element here, just based on your experience?
It's very difficult to answer these questions because it's of course always mixed between personalities and local contexts. I think the local contexts are really, really important. But I mean, that's a very tricky question. It's really difficult to answer.
Sorry about that.
Both variables play a role, of course, but it's really
I was just wondering for myself as I was reflecting on this, whether, if we have now a new sort of composition of a board, or like 3 very different people, could then things really be changed? And in a place like my university, I doubt it, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
May I add to this last point that we saw in the last, let's say, 2.5 rectors, for instance, that the different approaches, personal approaches to the community matters. It has a different style, of governance, of sharing, of allowing participation. And to the first, to Roberto's comment, I very much agree with what Alvin said. And what I would say more is that in Bologna, at least, this high participation is not, it was built in time with a lot of, there was a big work done on let's say, on feeling part of a community. And I think this has much to do with the level of participation. And also, when we told you that there were so many meetings which were very smaller groups, both large groups but also smaller groups, this is something which is exhausting for candidates, of course, and they say so. But it is a way for people to feel closer and to be acknowledged in their interests, in their needs, in their possibility to contribute. And I think this is valid for both the academics and the PTA.
That's social involvement, but let me go to the questions. Let me start with Jonathan Kropp, who wrote as first. It's a question for the 3 of you, or the 5 of you. What changes would you make to democratize university governance? Maybe choose one, each of you. The most urgent or the...
The most urgent.
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't precise, but I guess the one. What would you consider a priority?
I would, if I had one to say, my take would be that democracy is important, but maybe collegiality is more important. As far as, and we often confuse the two notions, and as far as the case of France is concerned, I don't know how it is in Italy or Netherlands, but I think in France, beyond the structures of decision making, we should instill maybe a more collegial culture, and it's not, and this is not. It's a day-to-day work in all, at all the layers of the organizational hierarchy, and not only in the decision-making bodies. And I think that would start with one very important point, is to welcome better the junior professor who are incoming in the system. At the time, they are just recruited like this in 10 minutes. We don't pay much attention to them. We charge them a lot with teaching, administrative duties, etc. So I think the strengthening of collegiality maybe should be, for me, a stronger priority than even reinforcing democracy. Maybe that's my view.
Anyone else want to ask this difficult and challenging question?
Well, I think from what I presented in the Dutch system, there's lots of room to democratize. I mean, there's room to strengthen the bodies that are actually elected, that have lost power. There, you could say you could start electing deans rather than, designating them, the executive board. I think there's lots of room there for that, but it wouldn't solve the key challenge of commercialization and new public management in the university, which we have today, I don't think. So it's of course part of that problem, because if you have a manager at the top, that's part with this ethos of commercializing and putting that management style into the university. But only by having now more elections, I don't think that would be sufficient to meet the current challenges.
Okay, then Thomas Teodorovitz asked, what is the perspective of the panelists on the trade-offs between democratizing higher education versus speed of adaptation to skilled degrees in demand? Or is this going, my question? On the future of work? So trade-off between democratizing higher education versus speed of adaptation to skilled degrees in demand on the future of work.
Mm-hmm.
Stéphanie, go.
No, Vicky, go ahead. No, I have, well, I would say that, again, I'm talking from the point of, France. I don't want to generalize, but I think French higher education institutions have made a huge effort to accompany to help, to attract, to have more students, but at the same time provide them professional degrees and help them to go to enter the job market. And actually, there's been a proliferation of new master degrees, professionalized, and so on. At the same time, with this proliferation, at the same time, what we observe is also a system of a stratification system. I mean, even in France, which was already the case in many other countries, but it was already the case in France with grandes écoles on one hand and universities on the other hand. So you have more and more prestigious universities, and more for good or bad reasons, universities that have less prestige in the eyes of the public. And so my sense is that those who are at the lower tiers of the rankings, of the prestige, have put even more and more efforts on the professionalized degrees to attract more students because they lack this prestige. So this is a bit troubling. But again, I think they made an incredible, effort and success in professionalizing their degrees. Vicky.
Yeah, I think similar in the Netherlands, there is, of course, this emphasis on meeting labor markets and having, having a student population that comes out and then can get a job and has all the skills that are necessary. But an overemphasis on this, of course, means that something else gets lost, and you just have to talk to the students that are running from one course to the other to collect their credits, to fill their CVs, in a very rushed time, in order to then enter the market. And if you talk to them, I have now, as we started this academic year, I mean, you get the sense that this idea of having time to reflect, to find yourself, to read beyond your narrow topic in order to get your bachelor credits very quickly, that if you overemphasize the training a workforce, then that will get lost. And the question is, what else does get lost in the bigger picture with that? So of course you need to also respond to that, but it's all about the balance. And it's all in the detail. And I don't have a scientific answer to this, but it relates to this idea of what do you think the university should do? And so higher education scientists will tell you that after the Second World War, it was more about having, creating critically thinking citizens that can participate well in a democratic society. And then with the advent of, the knowledge-based market economy, then that changed, and the emphasis was more on training a workforce, right? So we've seen a shift, I think, in that, and I think the Bologna process of the EU and the impact of the EU higher education policies through the higher education area have been very influential in changing the policy discourse at national level of what education should do. But there hasn't been necessarily much critical reflection on it, as everyone is in the race for, entering the markets.
Let me move to the next question because we have still all three. So can Basdil ask this question in Bogazici? Hope I'm reading this well, which is in Turkey. There have been protests for 10 months by students to challenge a centrally appointed rector. Have you any advice for the transition to self-governance by all members of the uni? I'm not sure it's an easy question, but no one apparently. Okay, I guess it's a little bit beside the competencies and of our speakers, and also, yeah, it's difficult to see how from the inside of university this kind of things could be handled, if not through some kind of protest, but the external condition doesn't seem to be very promising at the moment. Then Lisa Herzog, could democratization help to overcome the extreme siloization that one often sees in universities, everyone sitting in their disciplinary corner? If so, what form of democratization?
So sorry, can you repeat again? It's about disciplinary divides?
Yeah, the siloization is each discipline is staying on its own corner and communicating only with people from the same discipline.
Yeah.
Is there any way some kind of democratic practice could help overcoming this?
No, I would say I would love that. I mean, that would be a dream, that we invent a new democratic practice that helps cross fertilizations between disciplines. Unfortunately, the academic world is made by disciplines in silos, and all the evaluation systems, the journals, the academic journals, everything is structured by your career in France. For instance, I did my PhD in sociology. Now I am assistant professor in management, and I'm supposed to do habilitation in management, and I cannot do both. which is totally stupid. But the whole, so it's very difficult to beat the system here. And I don't see, that's a good, you know, I thank you for the question, Lisa. We could perhaps reflect about it, but I think this is bigger than us. But maybe still there are some efforts of interdisciplinarity in some places. But from my point of view, I don't see them very clearly. I mean, they're emerging, but they're not big enough.
Maybe I can paint a counter picture to that from the Netherlands when it comes to research, because as I explained, research funding happens externally on a competitive basis. And there is such an increased emphasis on interdisciplinarity, both at the Dutch grant authorities level and from the EU level. So there you reach a bit the opposite result. If you don't have an interdisciplinary project, then you will not get funding, which means you will not be able to do, you know, research. And maybe just as a counter, sort of a counter picture to that, some people are complaining that, you know, now you have these panels that don't understand anything from your discipline evaluating your work, you know. So again, I think extremes are always not good, but how to, that's our challenge, I think, from our generation now, how to find the golden mean, the good balance between the old sort of super disciplinarity system and then the new approach, especially when it comes to research funds that are focused on interdisciplinarity.
May I add just, thank you, Vicky, you just said what I wanted to say. Just another point on this is that, in fact, the focus on interdisciplinarity that has been put at European level in Europe.
We have missed you.
Can you hear me now? Right, good. No, I was saying that probably let's say the focus on interdisciplinarity was done because there is a stronger and stronger focus on trying to solve societal problems. So on the contribution that the universities, the higher education institution can give to solve societal problems. And societal problems are not disciplinary. Societal problem needs the contribution of several disciplines. I agree very much with what Stéphanie said, because of course we need to change, and there is a process going on at the moment at European level to change the assessment methods for publications and for productivity. I don't like this word, but yeah, you understood what I said, and so on. From a management point of view at the university, you need to keep together all the different components. Like from a comprehensive university as we are, we cannot allow ourselves to let, for instance, engineering go on, certain disciplines go on without the others. So by interdisciplinarity, you also succeed in sharing a little bit, being a little bit equal, also in the, equal is not the right word, fair, in the allocation of funds, okay, internally in the university. Because it is true that nowadays there are certain disciplines that have a much more access to funding system than others. And so you need to try to push for this interdisciplinarity, and this, at least we did some exercise to this purpose, and it is very also fruitful in terms of creativity that it stimulates in the research groups involved. So I think this is a very
may I just add a word on this? Thank you very much. It's very quickly, Roberto, because I think that this interdisciplinarity we're talking about here is a democratic problem, because if it is framed by funding systems, then the question is who decides which disciplines should be working with which disciplines, and so this is a completely different perspective from a kind of emerging interdisciplinarity solidarity, which would be focusing on the problems to solve, maybe, but that would not be framed by funding systems. So this is maybe a democratic problem here again.
Aren't funding systems funded by states, which means by citizens through their taxes, and therefore it's a form of truly democratic accountability in this sense? Citizens pay taxes that go to the state or European level, and with these taxes, research is financed to benefit citizens somehow. That's the kind of democratic accountability in, or at least that there should be a higher accountability if citizens had a more explicit way of saying which are, according to them, the social priorities which research should pursue. Then, of course, research has its own autonomy in researching, in attaining results. But at least there is, I think, a sort of democratic accountability in the way in which the dialogue between research, which is publicly funded, and those who fund it has a say in what this research should serve somehow. So, but I have lost Alvin, to whom I was trying to answer. Let me ask you the last question, because we have run out of time. It's a little bit provocative, so it's nice for giving you the opportunity to have a last say. This is from Julien Bravet. Don't you fear that the Amazon Google University is on its way?
Yes, it is, but we do not fear it.
Sorry, I lost you for a couple of seconds. I'm back, sorry.
So we were at the last question, which is whether you fear that Amazon or Google University is on its way.
Oh, I don't fear anything. I think we're going to change this way of, I would say, actually, this reflective thinking that Vicky talked about, I really believe in this. So let's see what Amazon and Google can do.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a pity we didn't have much time to discuss this question of the managerialization or commercialization of university, because it's really at the heart of many things concerning what does it mean to democratize and what does it mean for a university to open itself to the outside world, which are the way into which it can be done without threatening freedom of research on which you, Vicky, are working, but at the same time making the university, which, I mean, it's one of the criteria we always use to define whether an organization is democratic is the extent to which it is accountable to external stakeholders or internal. And this question of funding is a way of asking the question of accountability, because of course you have this trade-off between freedom of research and accountability of what you do as a public official. And I think this is something should be really much researched in this question, to what extent the democratic quality of university can be improved on the one hand by making people within the university to have a higher voice, academics and on the other, but on the other way, how we ourselves can be more accountable to the society and more inclusive also in the way into which we take into account external priority and needs. So maybe if you want to say something, 20 seconds each before we put a stop to this, just not to let me have the last word, which isn't nice, exactly.
I would just say, let's democratize, and maybe let's talk about democracy. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I guess it's everything. Thank you, everyone, for this nice panel. If you have time, follow the other panel. There are still more 70 or 80 tomorrow, today, tomorrow, and after tomorrow. And have a nice week.
Thank you very much also for organizing this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.